Let's stand and dismiss the children to Children's Church and sing Lord Reign in Me. Then Tim will come up. Over all the earth you reign on high, every mountain stream, every sunset sky. But my one request, Lord, my only aim, is that you reign in me again. Lord, reign in me, reign in your power over all my dreams. In my darkest hour, you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again, over every thought, over every word. May my life reflect the beauty of my Lord, 'cause you mean more to me than any earthly thing. So won't you reign in me again, Lord, reign in me, reign in your power over all my dreams. In my darkest hour, you are the Lord of all I am. So won't you reign in me again? So won't you reign in me again? Lord, won't you reign in me again? And please be seated.
Salome, hi. Good to see you back. Well, good morning. This past week, I came across something on Facebook that was posted by, I don't know what they call it, one of your friends on Facebook, I guess, but I met her once, but supposedly she's like my 14th cousin through marriage, so we're really close. But when I read the post, I thought, what she posted really reminded me of what we talked about last week about this idea of being an oasis. And so I wanted to share it with you kind of as a reminder of what we talked about last week, as well as kind of an encouragement of some of the things that maybe we can do when we think about serving and committing to serve as an oasis. And so here's what it is. It says, when a flashlight grows dim or quits working, you don't throw it away. You change the batteries. When a person messes up and finds themselves in a dark place, do you cast them aside? Of course not. You help them change their batteries. Some need AA, attention, affection, and attention. Some need AAA, attention, affection, and acceptance. Some need C, compassion. Some need D, direction. And if they still don't seem to shine, simply sit with them quietly and share your light. And as I read that, I thought, that has a lot to do with us being an oasis for someone. And it could be simply as simple as sitting and letting them share your light. So I wanted to mention that and share that with you this morning. To recap my thoughts over the last couple weeks as we talk about making 2022 a great year for God. 2 weeks ago, what we decided to do, or what we looked at, was we wanted to get rid of some qualities that really were not good. And so we took those qualities as we talked about them and we put them in the shredder. And those qualities were indifference and inactivity, inconsistency, indecisiveness, insensitivity, and being inhospitable. Basically with the idea that those qualities, if we have them, they really have no place if we want to make 2022 a great year for God. And so that's where we started 2 weeks ago. And then last week we did talk about this idea of oasis, that as a church as well as individuals, we need to do a few things here to help make 2022 a great year for God. And what we talked about really were three things. This church needs to be an oasis for one another. That we need each other as a church family sometimes to really be there to support and take care of one another. And then we looked at how this church needs to be an oasis for this community where we live. And then third, that God intends for you and for me really to serve as an oasis for others. And we talked about that idea of being an oasis. And so I really believe that, and I believe if we do that, we'll have an impact on people. And that impact could also then have an impact on our church family as well as the church as a whole. So what about today? What is Tim going to talk about today? Well, I'll tell you. Faster than a speeding bullet. More powerful than a locomotive. Able to leap tall buildings in a single bound. Look, up in the sky, it's a bird, it's a plane, it's... Thank you, somebody. Thank you, Julie. Wow. Well, that's not what I'm going to share with you today. I just want to get your attention. So, I won't even suggest that you need to be a Superman at all in order to really accomplish what I want to share with us today about making 2022 a great year for God. In fact, we don't have to be anywhere close to being super. We just need to be ordinary. Ordinary like Andrew in the New Testament. So that's what we're going to look at today. And you might be thinking, well, wait a minute, Tim, Andrew was one of Jesus' disciples. He later became an apostle. Those 12 guys hung out with Jesus. They could perform miracles at some point, and they watched Jesus ascend back to heaven. So really, how is that ordinary? Well, I'm not saying that Andrew was ordinary. But what the New Testament reports about what Andrew did was very ordinary. And Andrew, so we want to look at that today. Andrew's only mentioned, his name is mentioned 12 times in the New Testament. So 12 times the word Andrew appears. And so I want you to, we're going to look at those real quick. I just want to cover those. So 4 of those 12 times is just Andrew's name is in the list of all the apostles, all the disciples. So in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, he's listed with the 12. In Acts, he's listed with the 11 because Judas decided to hang out somewhere else. Okay, somebody got it. Thank you, Ken. I know, it was a dad joke. 2 other times, Andrew's listed with Peter, Andrew, and James in reference to Jesus calling them to be fishers of men. And then one time, it was Jesus, Peter, Andrew, James, and John who went to the house, to Peter's house, and where Peter's mother-in-law was sick, and Jesus ended up healing her or getting rid of her fever. But Andrew's just listed among those that were there. And then one time, Peter, Andrew, James, and John were just sitting with Jesus at the Mount of Olives over in Mark 13. And then one time, Andrew's listed because John is writing about Jesus calling Philip to be a disciple, and he just says, John says, you know, Philip was from the same town as Peter and Andrew, Bethsaida. So it's just a reference, a mention. However, there are 3 other passages, so those were 9 of them. There are 3 other passages where Andrew did something. He did something. Ordinary, but important. And so what Andrew did, I think you and I have probably done many, many times. And I bet we do it often. But it doesn't take super Bible knowledge. It doesn't take a great speaking voice. It doesn't take being able to perform miracles to do the ordinary thing that Andrew did. It doesn't take any of that. What Andrew did and what we each have the ability to do really is critical to helping people find Jesus. It's critical to building and growing this church, this congregation, and it's critical to growing the Lord's church worldwide. You know, I often think that maybe as Christians, we're guilty of expecting church growth to be miraculous, kind of like the day of Pentecost that Scott read about, where 3,000 were baptized that day. And we kind of think, well, that's how it's going to happen. That's how church growth is going to take place. Where they listened to Peter's message and 3,000 were baptized. Well, that's not very likely to happen today. We may also be guilty sometimes of, and even hesitant to even mention Jesus, depending on who we're around, or to mention religion or the Bible, even to the point of maybe somebody asks us, well, what did you do yesterday? Well, I went to church. What? I went to church. Oh, what'd you do Wednesday night? I went to church. And that's maybe sometimes we're guilty of that. Because we're afraid maybe that somebody would look at us differently, or they'd ask us a bunch of questions, or we'd have to quote some scripture, or maybe we'd have to all of a sudden find ourselves engaged in a lengthy Bible study that we're just not really comfortable being the leader of. But I think the reality is that church growth generally happens one person at a time, more often than not. One person at a time. And there's no rule that I can find in the Bible that says you have to memorize the entire Bible before you can do this very ordinary thing. And that ordinary thing that we have done and that Andrew did, that we're going to look at today, is Andrew made introductions. He introduced people. Kind of like this, like, hey, Mom, this is my friend Johnny. Oh, okay. Hey, Ken, this is my neighbor Janet. Or, hey, Tim, these are my kids, Annie and Billy. Okay, it's just a simple, ordinary introduction. We've done that many times, and I'm sure we do it without even thinking about it. Andrew made introductions to Jesus. When you look at Andrew's 12 times in the New Testament mentioned, 3 of those times it was Andrew who actually did something. The other times he was just listed with a bunch of other people. But what he did was he made introductions to Jesus. And that's where I want us to look today. I want us to look at those 3 times because I think it's something that we need to be more mindful of. I think it's something that we need to be more intentional about. So the first one is found in 1 John, beginning of verse 35. And I want to read that to you. And I want you to listen to what it says when we get to what Andrew actually did. So, it said the next day, John was there again, this is John the Baptist, with 2 of his disciples. When he saw Jesus passing by, he said, "Look, the Lamb of God." When the 2 disciples heard him say this, they followed Jesus. Turning around, Jesus saw them following and asked, "Well, what do you want?" They said, "Rabbi," which means teacher, "where are you staying?" "Come," he replied, "and you will see." So they went and saw where he was staying and spent that day with him, and it was about the 10th hour. Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, was one of the 2 who heard what John had said and who had followed Jesus. The first thing Andrew did was to find his brother Simon and tell him, "We have found the Messiah," that is the Christ, and he brought him to Jesus. Jesus looked at him and said, "You are Simon, son of John. You will be called Cephas," which, when translated, is Peter. If you think about that, here Andrew he was one of those early disciples of John the Baptist. But yet he knew, because John the Baptist made it clear, John the Baptist wasn't the Messiah. And so when he's standing with John the Baptist, and here comes Jesus walking by, and John the Baptist points out that Andrew's like, "See ya." And he and this other unnamed disciple start following Jesus. And they get to spend the day with Jesus. How many of us would love to spend the day with Jesus? Just listening, asking questions, hearing what he had to say. So Andrew spends the day with Jesus, and then at the end of that time together, right away he's convinced that Jesus definitely is the Messiah. He is the one that was prophesied about. And so what does he do? He runs to get his brother Peter, Simon at that point. So he runs to find him because he wants him to know. And so he goes there, and in verse 41, he just tells him, he says, when he finds him, he says, "We have found the Messiah." But verse 42 is really so important. I think without verse 42, church growth never happens. And that's this. And he brought him to Jesus. He brought him to Jesus. He introduced Simon, his brother, to Jesus. And of course, right away, it says, well, I'm going to change your name here a little bit. I'm going to call you Peter or Cephas from now on. But he brought him to Jesus. Andrew first got to know Jesus personally by spending that day with him. And then he wanted to share that with his brother. He was excited because of about the good news. He was excited that he actually met the Messiah. And so he went to find somebody near and dear to his heart, his brother. And he brings him to introduce him to Jesus. Now, what was the result of that introduction? How impactful did that introduction become? Just how big of a role did Andrew's brother Peter play in the forming of the New Testament church? And in scriptures where Peter appears and we read about him, his successes as well as his failures. Do you think Andrew knew what was going to happen when he introduced his brother to Jesus? I don't think so. Do you think Peter knew what was going to happen? I don't think so. But what I do know is this. By bringing his brother to meet Jesus, Andrew planted a seed. He opened a door so that Jesus could take Andrew's ordinary act of just introducing someone, and he turned it into something amazing. He turned it into something amazing. He turned it into the life that Peter would lead. And when we read about Peter in the New Testament and all the things that he did do, those things that we can learn from, the good things and even some of Peter's mistakes, and then we learn and we can read the letters of 1st and 2nd Peter, just think, it all started with an introduction.
That's right.
It all started with an ordinary act by his brother to introduce him to Jesus. That's the first one. The second one I want us to look at is in John 6, and it really probably goes verses 1 to 14. And I'm not going to read that one because that one's a little lengthy, and most of us know it. It's about when Jesus fed the 5,000. So I'll just kind of summarize it. Jesus was wanting to get away for a while. He and his disciples went across the Sea of Galilee on the other side. They wanted to take a break. Well, then Jesus looks up, and this crowd that he tried to get away from, they have come to. They followed him. And if you look at Matthew and Mark's writings about feeding the 5,000, it pretty much says that the disciples are saying, hey, it's kind of late. People are going to be hungry. We probably should send them away. Let them go find their own food somewhere. There's a McDonald's, there's Arby's. Let them go find their own food. And Jesus was like, no, you guys feed them. Well, that was a bit of a challenge. But then when you look at John, what John says about it, John gets a little more specific. And this is what he says. During that conversation in John, it says, another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will they go among so many? But see, what we have here is we have Andrew, again, making an introduction. He made an introduction. He introduced the boy to Jesus and Jesus to the boy. And I tried to envision, there's 5,000 people, maybe more, in this multitude, and the 12 apostles just got charged by Jesus to figure out how to feed them. And I can just see these 12 guys kind of wandering through this crowd or huddling somewhere like, how are we going to do it? Hey, there's some berries over there. Let me pick some of those. There's a fig. Let me grab. I don't know. But I wonder, too, did they pass by that boy? Did the other 11 see the boy and maybe they're calling to the crowd, has anybody got any food? Maybe the little boy says, well, I have this lunch. Maybe they dismissed him because they didn't think much about it. How's that going to work? But not Andrew. Andrew did what Andrew does. He brought the boy and made an introduction of the boy to Jesus. And then at that point, Jesus took over. Jesus took over. And he had everybody sit down, and he blessed the bread, and he blessed the fish, and he sent it out to be distributed. And everybody that was there ate till they were full. And then Jesus said, well, let's collect what's left. Now remember, this was 5 barley loaves and 2 little fish. There were 12 baskets left that they collected. Andrew made an introduction, and then he left it to Jesus to work on what happened from there. He introduced him to a small boy, somebody that maybe others had looked at and decided, not going to mess with bothering Jesus with this. You see, we can't predict or control the outcome. But what we can do, and what we should do, but what we can do is like what Andrew did. Make the introduction and then give the rest to Jesus. Yeah. I wonder, have you ever dismissed somebody? Have you ever thought, what do they have to offer? Or what good is it to introduce them to Jesus? They probably don't want to hear about Jesus, and they don't really look like the Jesus type. We need to make sure we leave room for Jesus to work. All we need to do is make an introduction. And then the third time that his name is mentioned is in John 12, 20 through 22. We'll take a quick read of that one because it's only 3 verses. It said, now there were some Greeks among those who went to worship at the feast. They came to Philip, who was from Bethsaida in Galilee, with a request. Sir, they said, we would like to see Jesus. Philip went to tell Andrew, and Andrew and Philip in turn told Jesus. Some Greeks were there in this group that was worshiping. They talked to Philip. Philip goes to Andrew. Why does Philip go to Andrew and not take care of it himself? I don't know. Maybe it's because Philip looked up to Andrew because Andrew might have had a little more important place maybe in the circle of the 12. Maybe it's because they were from the same hometown. Maybe Andrew was older. I don't know. But what I do know is that when he went to Philip, or when Andrew was approached by Philip, Andrew knew what to do. Because that's what Andrew did. He did the ordinary thing of going to Jesus and saying, hey, Jesus, there's some people here that would like to meet you. They'd like to meet you. Now, we don't read anywhere in the New Testament where it says Andrew specifically preached a sermon, or baptized anyone, or healed anyone, or boldly opposed the religious leaders of the day. It doesn't say any of that specifically about Andrew, or that he was even thrown in prison. Maybe he did. Maybe that happened, but it's not written that way here. But here's what we know. Andrew introduced his brother Simon to Jesus. And we can read pages after pages in the New Testament about what Simon Peter did. The sermons he preached, the people he healed, the people he baptized, the boldness he displayed in face of opposition. It started out with Andrew believing in Jesus and then wanting to introduce his brother to Jesus. After that, Jesus took over, and Peter became a powerful figure in the first century church. He became a powerful figure for all of us because of what he wrote and the way he lived. Because, every one of us in some way is Peter. Because we make mistakes just like Peter did. And sometimes we have really good days. But would Peter have even been Peter if it hadn't been for that introduction? And then, while none of the other disciples were credited with introducing the boy and his small lunch to Jesus, Andrew was. And after that, Jesus took over, and he fed thousands. And while it doesn't really say what happened with the introduction of the Greeks, Andrew didn't judge. He didn't say, well, they're Greeks. I don't know if we want to bother Jesus with this. I'm not sure they're worthy. They're just Greeks. He didn't do that. He didn't do that. He did what he was comfortable and capable of doing. He introduced them to Jesus. So, how do you and I introduce somebody to Jesus? I mean, we make introductions all the time. How do we do that, though, when it comes to introducing somebody to Jesus? I got a few thoughts to share real quick. I think, first of all, we introduce them to Jesus by the way that we live. Now, that's a tough one, because that puts a whole lot of pressure on us. My point being is this: will they meet Jesus by knowing us? And that's a challenge we face every day. Another way that they could meet Jesus is by us being open to opportunities, to going up to someone that we see or we hear about and saying, hey, I see that you're upset, or I see you're struggling. Can I pray with you? Or how about, coming and worshiping with us this week? We look for opportunities. Another way is that we watch and listen for people's needs, and we become their oasis, like we talked about last week. And then we do sometimes just simply come right out and say, hey, would you like to come to worship service with us this Sunday? Another way to meet Jesus. Or maybe you're volunteering at the pantry and you talk to a friend and say, hey, I'm volunteering at the Helping Hands Pantry this Saturday. Would you like to come and help? We're always looking for people to help. I guarantee you they'll meet Jesus there, because I know the people that work there and that volunteer there. Or maybe you go up to somebody you know and you say, hey, they're having a pasta dinner, the teens are, at North Park, to help raise money so they could go to Winterfest. I'd like to invite you to come to the pasta dinner with me. I'll even pay for it. And I know they'll meet Jesus there and you know why? Because I know some of you will be there. And they'll get to meet Jesus by getting to meet you. And then lastly, I think by sharing and living your story with people. By sharing and living your story with people. You see, I know there are people here today who are only here because somebody took the care and the concern to introduce you to Jesus. And that's how your story began. And so I think we can make that introduction, because some of us actually lived that. We are the result of somebody making an introduction to Jesus. Finding Jesus, growing this congregation, adding to the Lord's church worldwide, all good things, all things that can start with an introduction. Joe Nicosia has been spending a great deal of time preparing for a Bible class that he's going to start teaching next Sunday morning at 9:30 downstairs, called Bring, Teach, Keep. Back in October, a gentleman came here and spent a weekend talking just about that, about how really, in essence, we can grow the church by just doing those things. Bring, teach, keep. But you know what? So I hope you'll consider being a part of that class, because I think that study and what will come from that will also help make 2022 a great year for God. But it all begins with bring. It begins with bring. It begins with making the introduction and bringing somebody with us, or introducing somebody to Jesus, even if that introduction just means you introduce them to somebody else you know from North Park. It's something pretty ordinary, something Andrew did well. We introduce somebody to Jesus, and then we let Jesus take over. Now, why is that important? Why is that so important to look for ways to introduce someone to Jesus? Why is it worth our time? Why is it worth our effort or our fear of rejection or embarrassment? Why is it worth it to do that, to introduce somebody to Jesus? Here's why. 1 John chapter 5, verse 12. He who has the Son has life. He who does not have the Son of God does not have life. Seems to me being ordinary like Andrew could make introducing someone to Jesus life-changing. And so I think that can help make 2022 a great year for God. Ken?